Hello, and welcome to the Wednesday edition of the Christian Science Monitor. My name is Pam, and here is your first article. See the Fire? George Floyd and the Effects of Violent Protest. How George Floyd protesters might help or hurt their cause by adopting violence as attacked by Patrick Johnson. After the killing of George Floyd by a white policeman in Minneapolis last Monday, Karen White cried, "I cry for George Floyd because I cry for my sons," the black middle-class Savannah mom said while marching peacefully along with 2,000 people on Sunday. The killing of a black man by a policeman's knee to the neck awoke something in Miss White, by her own account. The old her would have been horrified by images of people looting and setting fires to protest police violence. But now, she says, such offenses against property seem apt in the face of systemic racism. If all 50 states have to see the fire in order for justice to prevail, then so be it, says Ms. White. As protests intensify from Washington, D.C. to Walnut Creek, California, the morality of protest violence is being debated in new ways in a nation roiled by the reaction to a Minneapolis policeman choking Mr. Floyd. To be sure, the vast majority of the demonstrations are peaceful, but some aggressive elements within the crowds continue to clash with police, especially after dark, and especially in places where authorities have responded to protests with their own violent means, such as tear gas and rubber bullets. The protesters have angered President Donald Trump, who on Monday called state and local leaders weak for failing to dominate them. Former President Barack Obama, with more measured language, urged an end to the destruction of property in an essay released Monday on Medium. If we want our criminal justice system and American society at large to operate on a higher ethical code, then we have to model that code ourselves, Mr. Obama wrote. Yet to many like Ms. White, what they see as intractable systemic racism and unjustified police killings of black Americans has begun to give legitimacy to what the Reverend Martin Luther King Jr. called the language of the unheard, riots in the face of injustice. There are elements here that I have not seen before, including that I'm hearing the perspective that perhaps the violence isn't as nihilistic as authorities make it out to be, says Darnell Hunt, author of Screening the Los Angeles Riots, Race, Seeing, and Resistance. It seems different this time because you are hearing echoes of something bigger. The American Reckoning. The impulse of authorities to blame agitators and step up the response to dominate the streets goes back to the 1960s when Richard Nixon rode to presidential victory in part by exploiting racial tensions and promising law and order. Nixon's strategy found fertile ground in an American then reeling from widespread riots in the long hot summers of 1967 and following the assassination of Dr. King in 1968. Back then, National Guard and regular Army units deployed to city streets to bring widespread looting and burning under control. Today, America as a whole is facing a similar reckoning, says Mr. Hunt. The U.S. has suffered through numerous well-publicized incidents of people of color being killed after being falsely profiled as suspicious. Even before a self-appointed Florida neighborhood watchman named George Zimmerman shot a teenage boy, Trayvon Martin, in 2012, the beating of Rodney King in 1992, and the killings by police of Amadou Diallo in 1999, Sean Bell in 2006, and Oscar Grant in 2009 had been ingrained in the national consciousness. The death of Mr. Floyd was only the latest such incident. Meanwhile, well-armed white men who shuffled inside the Michigan Capitol to liberate the state from its pandemic closure were treated gently, says Jennifer Kobina, author of Hands Up, Don't Shoot, and a criminal justice professor at Michigan State University in East Lansing. Yet, peaceful protesters marching in Washington in response to Mr. Floyd's killing were tear gassed so President Trump could stand in front of a church. There is a stark contrast in the response to when there were angry white men protesting with assault rifles against lockdown orders and were met by a police force that was very calm, says Dr. Kobina. Yet people are looting and rioting, but the contrast remains stark because we see different reactions depending on who is demonstrating. The situation shows how the demographics of the people protesting shapes the police response. Meanwhile, in greater Los Angeles, demographics figured in protesters' larger strategy. Organizers specifically chose upscale areas such as the gentrified downtown, Beverly Hills, and the beachside community of Santa Monica to bring their message home. We've been very deliberate in saying that the violence and pain and hurt that's experienced on a daily basis by Black folks at the hands of a repressive system should also be visited upon, to a degree, to those who think that they can just retreat to white affluence. Melina Abdullah, a Los Angeles Black Lives Matters leader, told KPCC Radio on Sunday morning. In a pattern repeated throughout the weekend, demonstrations would begin peacefully and then looting would set into the night. Los Angeles police and political leaders are publicly voicing support for the peaceful demonstrators and dismay at the death of Mr. Floyd, but they are condemning the looters, who they say are well organized and not from this area. Similar claims made by authorities in other cities have been undetermined by the facts. Minneapolis officials had to walk back charges that many protesters were infiltrated after a media analysis of public records showed that the vast majority of those arrested were Minnesotans. New York Mayor Bill de Blasio argued that the bulk of the troublemakers were out-of-towners. But this week, his daughter was arrested during the protest. A crumbling of the out-of-towner troop is evidence that authorities and the mainstream media are having a hard time controlling and shaping the narrative of the Floyd uprising, says Dr. Hunt, Dean of Social Sciences at UCLA. Historically, the media has traditionally parroted the official mind, minimizing the importance of what's actually happening in the streets, says Mr. Hunt, the Dean of Social Science at UCLA. He senses a different arc of coverage this time. Violence and attention. Nonviolence has a storied position in the civil rights movement. King famously espoused nonviolence as the most effective means of lifting up Black Americans. But violence against property, despite the risks, may be a last choice tool for change if a moral imperative makes it justified, says some experts. Property damage and social turmoil often do promote more social change as they force the authorities to pay attention, says Pam Oliver, a professor emeritus of sociology at the University of Wisconsin, who tracks media responses to social unrest in an email. Historically, she says, that has been a two-edged sword as focus shifts from the underlying structures to the scope of violence. But many Americans, she says, seems to be reassessing the meaning of violence with respect to property damage. In Minneapolis, for example, one owner of an Indian restaurant that went up in flames told friends and relatives, "Let my building burn. Justice needs to be served." The difference now, as you are seeing, is that many people make a moral distinction between property damage and hurting people. David Harris, author of A City Divided, Race, Fear, and the Law in Police Confrontations, has a somewhat different opinion. He has watched the violence versus nonviolence scenario play out just miles from his house in Pittsburgh, where protests turned violent Saturday and where there was more conflict Monday night, allegedly exacerbated by the police response. The pain and the anger are real and great and, honestly, rational, says Mr. Harris, a professor at the University of Pittsburgh School of Law. The concern is that when the protests become violent, either against property or the police, even if you can make an argument that it is somehow understandable, what happens is that those who would prefer to ignore the underlying and real issues all of a sudden have a way to stop discussing what happened. The president isn't talking about George Floyd or a systemic failure to correct police accountability. He's talking about the violence he sees on his TV screen, says Mr. Harris. Meanwhile, one positive development highlighted across the U.S. in recent days is evidence that protesters are not strictly anti-police. In Savannah and elsewhere, protesters have urged police to walk with us, and some have. Over the past week, that pattern has sharpened as police strategy has been divided between escalated use of force and what's called negotiated management, where officials take a hands-off approach amid assurances from organizers that protests remain peaceful. Crackdowns have multiplied violence, says Ms. Kobina. Acknowledgement and solidarity have won hearts and limited damage. That dynamic could be seen in Newark, New Jersey, a city where 26 people were killed in riots in 1967, but where there were no arrests on Sunday, despite a large, raucous protest. Well, moving on, our next article is entitled Feeding America During COVID-19, How Food Pantries Are Meeting Record Demand. Amid COVID virus shutdown, America's food pantries are facing a perfect storm of challenges. Need, cost, and pantry closures have all spiked. By Jeffrey McDonald, correspondent. On a crisp May evening, Wendy Bauer had earned a rest by the time dusk fell on a middle school gymnasium that was transformed into a supersized food pantry for the pandemic. Responding to a 630% increase in need since mid-March, she and her team of 55 volunteers had just handed out full grocery bags to about 375 families reeling from this gateway city's economic collapse. It was time to go home. But Miss Bauer, who's directed the First Congregational Church of Revere's food pantry in Massachusetts for 18 years, wasn't relaxed as she leaned on a stack of canned soup cases. She was worrying. If even one volunteer tests positive for COVID-19, she said, the operation might grind to a halt as all contacts would have to quarantine. Just as concerning, the prospect of running out of food. Every week it's a struggle to resupply, to get more food, says Ms. Bauer, who also runs a research lab at Tufts Medical Center. All of the food pantries are competing for a time slot at the food bank warehouse. Some days I can't even get a slot. I get online at midnight when you can pick your slot, but when I get on, they're all taken. They're gone within 1 second. Such anxieties aren't unique to this pantry in Revere, a city of 53,000. America's network of 40,000 food pantries, which give away food as part of a patchwork emergency system, is facing a perfect storm of challenges spawned by the coronavirus outbreak. Need, costs, and pantry closures have spiked simultaneously. Volunteers, including Ms. Bauer, now scramble to prevent what happened in Revere in mid-March when the pantry ran out of food for the first time in its 36-year history and had to turn people away. Unprecedented challenges. Nationwide, as many as 10,800 pantries and meal programs have shut down since the pandemic began, according to figures from Feeding America, a network of 200 food banks serving pantries and meal programs. One reason? Not enough volunteers. Many were run by seniors who are now high risk and stay home to avoid the virus. Others have had to close after someone tested positive for COVID-19. Meanwhile, the need has skyrocketed. Pantries and meal programs gave out about 32% more food in April than a year earlier, according to Feeding America, as the number of food insecure Americans jumped from 37 million in 2018 to as many as 54 million today. The emergency food system is dependent on charitable organizations, on volunteers, on quick adaptability, and that's been challenged during this time, says Alicia Powers, Managing Director of the Hunger Solutions Institute at Auburn University in Alabama. These systems have been tried in ways that we never imagined. What's more, staples are getting more expensive, if pantries can find them at all. The Greater Boston Food Bank used to be able to offer pantries more options at no cost, But lists of available free items are getting shorter and shorter, according to Vice President of Distribution Services Jonathan Tetrault. At this point, the options to choose from are diminishing because of the supply chain challenges, Mr. Tetrault said. For no-cost pantries, we're able to get pasta, white rice, brown rice, black beans, pinto beans, and kidney beans. Now your options this week is white rice only and one type of bean. Grocery chains have been selling out of items like canned vegetables, leaving them with less to donate to food banks, according to Feeding American spokesperson Zuani Villarreal. That leaves pantry organizers having to pay at food banks or buy from stores at a time when everything from eggs to meat is costing more due to heightened demand and scant supply. Since the pandemic started, I have to buy more at the store and I have to pay more for it, says Linda Crocker, a volunteer pantry coordinator at the Memorial Church of the Good Shepherd in Parkersburg, West Virginia. In normal times, she spends about $1,000 a month to stock her pantry to feed about 45 families. Now, with less at food banks, higher prices in stores, and more families seeking help, her spending has jumped about 30%. Meeting growing needs. New challenges facing pantries are on display every Wednesday night here at Rumney Marsh Academy, which the city of Revere converted to an emergency food hub soon after schools closed for the pandemic. Prior to March, the pantry, Revere's only one, had been located at the church, where a human chain would pass bundles up from the basement through a hole in the floor. But that was when 8,000 pounds of food and supplies a month was enough. Now, the pantry is going through upward of 40,000 pounds a month. Moving temporarily to the larger school facility on a state highway was essential. Before distribution began at 7 p.m., more than 100 cars form two lines that wind around the building. Dozens of pedestrians line up beside them on a sidewalk. Everyone is wearing masks. Guidelines to stay 6 feet apart are loosely followed. On this night in mid-May, 72% of pantry visitors are Hispanic, up from 33% in mid-March, according to Ms. Bauer. Speaking in Spanish, one guest after another tells a similar story of layoffs. Jose Santiago lost his janitorial job at a food processing center. Leticia Restrepo is no longer cooking at a restaurant. Jorge Tovan can't work at the airport hotel where he tends a bar for 14 years. All have stretched their personal accounts for weeks, then started coming to the pantry in May because it was getting tougher to provide for family members who depend on them. I was embarrassed to come here, but now we need it, says Angela, who asked that her last name not be used. She thought her furlough from office work would be brief, but 2 months later she's still unemployed. People see the need. Inside, volunteers stuffing bags in assembly line fashion say it's just their second or third week at the pantry. Among those answering the call for helpers is David Etow, a Revere High School biology teacher. He's seen up close what it means for Revere to have one of the highest infection rates in Massachusetts. 2 students at the high school lost a parent to the virus, he said, and a former student has died as well. Volunteers come with health risks, but Mr. Etow feels the risks are manageable and worth it. Like other volunteers, he wears gloves, keeps his mask on, and fills bags to feel helpful in a situation that's left many feeling helpless. I'm helping the community and at the same time helping myself by keeping busy, Mr. Etow said. Volunteering at the pantry alleviates some of that sense of helplessness that I think all of us feel to some degree. Behind the scenes, Mr. Bauer aims to keep one wall of the gymnasium stacked 6 feet high from end to end with chickpeas, canned tomatoes, pasta, and other goods. She takes pride in stocking proteins such as ground turkey, cheese, and frozen eggs, which are stored separately in a school kitchen. But the logistics can be daunting. On her June to-do list, lining up a reliable volunteer trucker, if needed, to transport supplies. In the meantime, she stretches her budget by stocking up on whatever she can get free from the food bank, such as cases of USDA peanut butter. For a 5,000-pound midweek delivery, she paid for only 3 items, 480 jars of jelly. It goes with the peanut butter, 2,000 shopping bags, and a case of gloves for volunteers, for a total of $601. Now, as she prepares to leave for the night, her phone rings. It's her pastor with good news. The pantry got a $10,000 donation from a Boston healthcare organization. She can use it. The pantry spent about $10,000 on food in April, a tenfold increase from a year earlier. Sometimes it can be 6,000 pounds, and I'm paying $1,000 because none of the stuff I want happens to be free, Ms. Bauer said. On the plus side, there have been a lot of donations. People see the need. Well, this next article is titled Historic First. SpaceX delivers U.S. astronauts to space station. After Saturday's historic liftoff, the SpaceX Dragon capsule arrived at the space station Sunday and docked automatically, no human help needed, by Marcia Dunn, AP Aerospace writer. SpaceX delivered 2 astronauts to the International Space Station for NASA on Sunday, following up a historic liftoff with an equally smooth docking in yet another first for Elon Musk's company. With test pilot Doug Hurley and Bob Behnken poised to take over manual control if necessary, the SpaceX Dragon capsule pulled up to the station and docked automatically, no assistance needed. The hatches swung open a few hours later, and the 2 Dragon riders floated into the orbiting lab and embraced the 3 station residents. Unlike the SpaceX and NASA flight control rooms where everyone was spaced well apart, there was no social distancing or masks needed in orbit since the new arrivals had been in quarantine for many weeks. The whole world saw this mission, and we are so proud of everything you have done for our country and, in fact, to inspire the world, NASA Administrator Jim Bridenstine said in a call from Mission Control to Houston. Mr. Hurley credited SpaceX and added, "It's great to get the United States back in the crewed launch business." It was the first time a privately built and owned spacecraft carried astronauts to the space station in its more than 20 years of existence. NASA considered this the opening volley in a business revolution, encircling Earth and eventually stretching to the Moon and Mars. NASA is not going to purchase, own, and operate rockets and capsules the way we used to, Mr. Bridenstine said. We're going to partner with the commercial industry. The docking occurred barely 19 hours after a SpaceX Falcon 9 rocket blasted off Saturday afternoon from Kennedy Space Center, the nation's first astronaut launch to orbit from home soil in nearly a decade, and drawing a Washington delegation led by President Donald Trump. NASA said peak viewership online hit 10 million. Despite the coronavirus pandemic, thousands jammed surrounding beaches, bridges, and towns as SpaceX ended a 9-year launch drought for NASA. The achievement, years in the making, is expected to drive down launch costs so more people might be able to afford a ticket to space in the coming years. Mr. Behnken told the welcoming committee at NASA's Johnson Space Center that the Dragon was a slick vehicle, and he said he was surprised at how rough the ride was on the latter part of ascent, compared with the space shuttle, which he and Mr. Hurley rode twice. Dragon was huffing and puffing all the way into orbit, he said. 2 Texas members of Congress at Johnson for the docking, Senator Ted Cruz and Republican Brian Babin, said the flight offered inspiration and hope during a particularly tough time of protest and pandemic. Having it go off without a hitch was a tremendous blessing for our country, Mr. Babin told the astronauts. Gleaming white in the sunlight, the Dragon was easily visible on NASA TV from a few miles away from the space station, its nose cone open and exposing its docking hook as well as a blinking light. Mr. Hurley and Mr. Behnken took over the controls and did a little piloting less than a couple hundred yards out as part of the test flight before putting it back into automatic for the final approach. Once on board the space station, Mr. Hurley said the capsule, newly named Endeavour after the retired shuttle, handled extremely well. He was the pilot on the last U.S. spaceship to visit the space station, the last shuttle flight by Atlantis in July 2011. Restoring American launch capabilities 9 years later, he noted, is just one effort that we can show for the ages in this dark time that we've had over the past several months to kind of inspire, especially the young people in the United States, to reach for these lofty goals. There was one small glitch. Mr. Hurley bumped his head entering the space station and frequently wiped his forehead during the welcoming ceremony. NASA turned to private industry to pick up the slack following the shuttle's fleet's retirement, hiring SpaceX and Boeing in 2014 for space station taxi services. Boeing's first astronaut flight isn't expected until next year. Until Saturday, SpaceX had launched only one space station supplies or satellites. The company's employees took to calling the astronauts dads to drive home the fact that 2 lives were at stake in the highly technical effort. Clearly relieved, NASA Administrator Jim Bridenstine tweeted a big welcome home to the Dragon Flyers, America's 2 favorite dads. NASA has yet to decide how long Mr. Hurley and Mr. Benkin will spend at the space station, somewhere between 1 and 4 months. While they're there, they'll join NASA's Chris Cassidy and 2 Russian station residents in performing experiments and possibly spacewalks to install fresh station batteries. While U.S. astronauts will continue to catch a ride on Russian Soyuz rockets, it will be through a barter system now that NASA's Commercial Crew program has finally taken flight. NASA has been shelling out tens of millions of dollars for every Soyuz seat. In a show and tell earlier Sunday, the astronauts gave a quick tour of the Dragon's sparkling clean insides, quite spacious for a capsule. The blue sequin dinosaur accompanying them, their young son's toy named Tremor, was also in good shape. Mr. Benkin assured viewers Tremor was going to join Earthy, a plush globe delivered to the space station on last year's test flight of a crewless crew, Dragon. Mr. Benkin said both toys would return to Earth with them at mission's end. An old-style capsule splashdown is planned. After liftoff, Mr. Musk told reporters that the capsule's return will be more dangerous in some ways than its launch. Even so, getting the 2 astronauts safely to orbit and then the space station had everyone breathing huge sighs of relief. As always, Mr. Musk was looking ahead. This is hopefully the first step on a journey towards a civilization on Mars, he said Saturday evening. Well, our next article is entitled Vote by Mail. Is it safe, fair, and ready for November? Several states already let the public vote by mail in elections, but amid the coronavirus pandemic, the debate over mail-in voting has new urgency. By Krista Case Bryant. Many states have expanded mail-in voting ahead of the 2020 election in order to ensure fair access for all amid the ongoing pandemic. This had led to concerns that the expected surge in people voting by mail could lead to delays in the inaccuracies that would undermine faith in the election results. In mail-in voting the same as absentee voting? Well, no, absentee voters must request a ballot to be mailed to them. Mail-in voting states send every registered voter a ballot automatically. Currently, all states allow absentee voting. However, a third required voters to provide a reason for why they cannot vote in person. Most of those states have eased their rules, including by making COVID-19 concerns a valid reason for requesting an absentee ballot. Prior to the pandemic, 5 states voted entirely by mail: Colorado, Hawaii, Oregon, Utah, and Washington. 3 additional states, California, Nebraska, and North Dakota, allowed counties to institute voting by mail if they so chose. And 9 more states allow certain elections, such as special elections or nonpartisan issue elections, to be done entirely by mail. This year, with the pandemic exacerbating concerns about lack of safe access to polling places, at least half a dozen states are mailing every registered voter an absentee ballot application in upcoming primaries. 2 of those, Connecticut and Michigan, are doing so for the November general election as well. California Governor Gavin Newsom has gone a step further, saying he would automatically send the state's more than 20 million voters absentee ballots without an application process. What are the challenges to expanding mail-in voting? The first challenge is the rushed time frame. Most of the current vote by mail, or VBMs, states have given themselves a year between enacting the legislation and conducting their first election by mail. One reason for that is the need to bring voters' lists up to date. Some also establish a database of voters' signatures used to certify the authenticity of absentee voting. Second is the infrastructure required. A surge in the mailed ballots would require much more powerful scanning machines at centralized locations rather than smaller ones in each precinct. The $400 million that Congress allocated this spring to help states safely run elections amid the pandemic is not likely to cover such a major equipment overhaul. Another issue is voter education campaigns to ensure that citizens are clear on the revised rules, including when ballots need to arrive in order to be counted. Such campaigns can present substantial upfront costs. However, in the long run, VBMs can cut costs. Colorado saved 40% on election administration costs after switching to the VBM model. In addition, there are concerns about the reliability of the U.S. Postal Service, which was already in deep financial trouble before the pandemic led to a double-digit drop in mail volume. While both Republican and Democrat-led states are making it easier to cast a ballot by mail, key areas of partisan disagreements are requesting a ballot online, free postage, witness signature requirements, and perhaps most important, how each state will establish standards governing disqualification of ballots. 24 legal challenges have already been launched. Well, what are the concerns? Democrats are concerned that without increasing vote by mail options, certain groups will not be able to cast ballots without risking their health, therefore undermining a pillar of U.S. democracy. They have proposed billions of dollars in federal funding for states that institute uniform practices, including adopting VBM systems. Republicans argue that such a move trespasses states' rights under the Constitution and raises the possibility of substantial inaccuracies. Among the concerns are ballot design flaws that mislead voters, voter confusion over the deadline for submitting ballots, delays in the tallying of votes, and signature mismatches that result in disqualification of ballots. In previous years, substantial numbers of absentee ballots have been disqualified, sometimes many more than the margin of victory. For example, when Al Franken won the 2008 Minnesota Senate race by 312 votes, giving Democrats the majority they needed to pass Obamacare, about 12,000 absentee ballots were thrown out. In some elections, such as Florida in 2016, minorities and young people have seen their ballots disqualified at a far higher rate. While the number of known cases of voter fraud is extremely low, one study puts it at less than, and get this, 0.000000013% of ballots cast in federal elections. Absentee voting is more susceptible to fraud than other forms. A bipartisan commission on federal election reform, co-chaired by former Presidents Jimmy Carter, concluded that absentee voting cases are especially difficult to prosecute, since the misuse of a voter's ballot or the pressure on voters occurs away from the polling place or any other outside scrutiny. A little noticed change to California law in 2016 paved the way for anyone, including paid campaign workers, to collect absentee ballots on behalf of voters, raising concerns about coercion not only from friends or family members, but campaigns themselves. In the 2018 midterms, Republicans were caught off guard by this practice, which they dubbed ballot harvesting, as tight races tipped against them after absentee voters were counted. Meanwhile, a GOP operative from North Carolina was charged with several counts of obstruction of justice for allegedly filling in ballots for for allegedly filling in ballots for absentee voters. The election was ordered thrown out and redone. With no excuse absentee voting in the 6 key swing states likely to determine the winner in November's presidential election, Arizona, Florida, North Carolina, Michigan, Pennsylvania, and Wisconsin, even relatively minor numbers of disqualified ballots or other irregularities could tip a tight race and potentially determine who will become the next president. Wow, that's something to think about, the exclusion of 12,000 voters. Whoa. Anyway, that's for you to think about today. This is a very, very wonderful article with much, much food for thought into our brains. And I want to say that concludes the reading of the Wednesday Christian Science Monitor. This is PM saying thank you for being with us today. Stay safe.